Now things get a little more fun as we start to explore the brushes. And we're going to start from a default scene just to ensure that all our brush settings have been reset to default. I'm going to select our cube, turn into a digital ball of clay with Control 5 in the viewport. Let's type in 7 for the viewport level, and then Control A as we hover over the modifier to apply it, and then switch to our sculpting workspace. And let's drag out our brushes so we can see the names. And the list is quite long. More brushes are added fairly often as technology advances, but you'll notice that the icons are organized by color to a degree. And so up top we have this light blue, and these are mainly additive brushes in that they kind of appear to add material to the surface. And so we'll focus on just the blue brushes for this video, and you'll see me kind of rank them by how often I use them, because it would be inaccurate to think that I use all of these regularly. I really only use a handful 95% of the time. So let's begin with the draw brush, which you've seen me use already. And this is kind of a standard 3D sculpting brush, very smoothly building up a rounded ridge of material. You know, I think of cartoons when a character burrows under the ground and that kind of shape that they leave behind. That's what this reminds me of. And to be honest, I do not use this brush hardly at all until I add sculptural texture detail. But we'll get to that later when we get into brush textures. But generally speaking, I do not use the draw brush that often. Next, we have the draw sharp, which I do use a lot. And as we stroke on the surface, this cuts a tight divot or trench into our mesh. And notice that the default behavior is set to subtractive, which I actually like to set to additive by default, because all of our blue brushes are set to additive except for draw sharp and crease, which are very similar brushes. And the way my mind works is the control hotkey is kind of mapped to subtractive. And so it throws me off whenever the draw sharp, I don't have to hold control to push it into the surface. And this could just be my preference, but I find it very helpful in my workflow to not have to think about that. And I can always hold control whenever I want to dig into the surface. And so I definitely use this a lot, way more than the regular draw brush. Next, we have the clay brush. And I'll just preface this by saying I never use this brush. I don't think I have ever in my, 12, 13 years of using Blender, have I ever used this brush. I would describe it sort of like dripping hot wax onto the surface. So it kind of builds up in these little circular shapes. And, you know, I can see why this would be useful, maybe. I've just never run into that situation. Next, we have clay strips, which is one that I do use a lot. And so this is a behavior that I think comes from traditional sculpting whenever they use strips to build up the structure. And in Blender, it's used the same way in a kind of sketchy type of way. So when I say sketchy, if I use the annotation tool down at the bottom as a demonstration, if you try and draw a cube, or we're in 2D, so a square in one stroke, you know, it's going to be a little bit wobbly, imperfect, usually not the most ideal result. However, if we sketch it several strokes per side, it's a lot more forgiving and kind of messy and has its own aesthetic and its own utility. And so that's sort of what we're doing whenever we use the clay strips brush. And it's a very popular brush for digital sculptors. Let's go back there, clay strips, you know, to build up certain shapes at the early stages of sculpting. The biggest criticism is that it leaves all these lines, and that's rarely how you want to finish a sculpture. So you can expect to smooth out the shapes that you make, but that's just part of the process. And you can also, you know, use the flatten brush, but we'll get there. The point being, this is extremely effective for quick buildup of shapes in usually a much more preferable way than the draw brush would do. Next, we have the clay thumb brush. And I will say I've never used this brush. So let's try and see what it does just by, let's see. It's kind of difficult to really describe what it's doing. I feel like what it's trying to emulate is the mushy surface quality in real clay that you get from simply using your fingertips. And so I think if I, you know, lessen the effect, the strength of this brush, maybe it's just too high by default. Yeah, it's kind of creating this, you know, formed by human fingertips sort of texture aesthetic on the surface. And so there would be a reason to use this. I just would prefer to do it more globally in a single stroke with a brush texture rather than, touching every single part of the surface with this brush. But, I'm sure someone uses it a lot. I'm just not one of those people. Next, we have the layer brush. And this one I have used maybe 5 or 6 times in my entire career. As we click on the surface, it essentially extrudes a rounded chunk outward from the surface normal. And in our brush settings, we do have the ability to choose the height, because you can see that as the brush, as I make strokes over and over in the same spot, it never extends beyond a certain distance away from the original surface. But we can change that in the brush settings with the height option, and we can push it out much further. But, being the layer brush, it stops at that certain distance. And so as I make more of these, it starts to feel like a stylized moon surface, right? If I took our draw brush and held control to kind of push it in, it starts to look like a crater, maybe an octopus, sucker kind of thing. So, there's maybe a specific use for the layer brush. Not that you couldn't also do this with other brushes, but it's not one I use very often. Next, we have the inflate brush. This is one that I use all the time. And so this is similar to the draw brush. I kind of use it as a replacement for the draw brush because, most of the time on a smooth surface like this, it behaves very similar to the draw brush. It's a little more subtle, so I feel like I have more control. But if we take that draw sharp brush and I cut into the surface, remember I changed the behavior control. Now you might be thinking, didn't he just negate the reason he changed it? But trust me, whenever I kind of turn my mind off and go into sculpt mode and lean on muscle memory, I definitely want to have this set to positive by default. Anyway, so holding control to push inward, I create my little divot. And this looks pretty good, except it's not like a wrinkle, which is really tight. And, essentially a tighter crease would have these two surfaces on the sides kind of touching each other. And so if I take the inflate brush and stroke inside the divot, it brings those surfaces together. Inflate is pushing the surface outward according to the surface normal. And that's what, if we look in wireframe as we undo, we can see exactly what's happening. And I do that all the time. Draw sharp, inflate, and then also crease, which you'll see is very similar to draw sharp. Those two are like peanut butter and jelly in my workflow. Next, we have the blob brush. This one's similar to inflate. The really only difference I can tell is that it seems to multiply the effect on itself. Practically speaking, it keeps a harder edge so that it starts to look almost like a wart or some sort of bubble growing on the surface. And that is identified by that harsher edge, whereas the inflate brush by itself never really gets that harsh edge. And so I think I've used blob before, but it is not one of my regulars. And finally, we have the crease brush, which is very similar to draw sharp. One, in that it has a negative default behavior. I like to switch that to plus so that when I hold control, we crease into the surface, but you might notice that it's also pinching a little bit. It's pulling the surface toward the center of the brush. And in our brush settings, we have that additional pinch setting, so we can control how much it pinches. And while I do find that that does help, it's rarely enough by itself. And just like the draw sharp brush, I'll come in with the inflate brush and push those surfaces together. But draw sharp and crease, I more or less use interchangeably for the same scenarios. And so that's it for our blue brushes, but I haven't gone over the hotkeys. So out of these blue ones, I use crease, which is Shift C. I use inflate, which is I. I use clay strips, which is C. I think, yeah, you have to be hovering off of the tool panel. And then draw sharp, does that have one? No. So they don't all have hotkeys. You can set up your own if you like. But C for clay strips, I for inflate, Shift C for crease. I do use those all the time. Okay, next let's look at the red brushes.